Okay, before I can properly explain who Eratosthenes was, I have to talk a little bit again about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was from Macedonia, just north of Greece. His father was Philip of Macedon, a very powerful man who conquered part of Greece. Incidentally, Alexander studied under Aristotle, who studied under Plato, who studied under Socrates. So he had a great lineage. And classically, he's known as one who put wisdom and knowledge into action. Because, well, Socrates sat around in a toga talking about a lot of stuff, and Plato philosophized, and Aristotle philosophized. Alexander took over the world. In fact, it was said that he was a little bit upset when his father conquered part of Greece because he wanted all the credit for himself. Anyway, he conquered Greece. This is a map of Alexander's itinerary, Alexandria Itinera. Anyway, he conquered Greece. He came down, conquered the Lydians, sort of modern-day Turkey, came down, conquered Egypt. What he did was he kind of looped around, snuck up, and destroyed all of the ports along the coast. Because Egypt, because it had such great fertile soil, produced tons and tons of grain, and it would ship it to all sorts of places. Anyway, he destroyed all these, destroyed the capital. Then he came up. He went through Mesopotamia. I forgot to mention this in the history of the world, that he went through and conquered Mesopotamia, modern-day Persia, came all the way, he came up this way, conquering Persia, got up into here, wherever that is, came down. This is the Indus River. This is where the Indian subcontinent, what was known as India at that time. This is Pakistan nowadays, and India is the other side. Then anyway, he got sick, came over here and died. All of this happened between, say, 332 BC, he conquers Egypt, and 323 BC, he dies back in Persepolis. Why do I talk about Alexander? First of all, this is a great case of how Greek civilization meets up well. It already had exposure to Egyptian civilization. In fact, most of the Greek gods, most of the Greek traditions have their roots in Egypt. The Greeks stole a lot of stuff from this older and greater civilization at that time. But what Alexander did was he linked Greek civilization, Egyptian civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, Persian civilization, and Indian civilization. So in some sense, he really expands knowledge. Another cool thing he did, one of the things he did, he built all these cities named after him. Here's Alexandria. Here's Alexandria. Here's Alexandria. There's an Alexandria. But the one I want to talk about is the Alexandria in Egypt. He had destroyed all the ports in conquering Egypt, and he decided to build one in a perfect location for trading with Greece. And I thought this is so cool. What is it like to walk up to a spot on the coast and say, this is where I'm going to build a city? He said, hand me some chalk. I'm going to draw the streets on the ground. I will plan a city that will be named after me. They said, we don't have any chalk. He said, well, what do we have? They said, we have lots of flour because Egypt grows a lot of grain. They had tons and tons of flour. He drew lines in the ground with flour to say, okay, here's going to be the main road, and here's where all the streets are going to come off, and here will be the main circle, which of course will be named after me. And birds descended and started eating the grain off the ground. And he turned to one of his advisors, because as I've said before, the movements of birds, the actions of birds are signs of the pleasure or displeasure of the gods. And he said, what does this mean that the birds are eating up my streets? And of course, the wise advisor next to him didn't say, oh, your city's going to be for crap and this is a terrible thing, because you don't tell people like that bad news. Instead, he said, oh, it means that people will flock like birds to your city. And in fact, it did become a great city. Actually, there was one guy somewhere up, was it in Greece? Diogenes. Diogenes was the one guy who told off Alexander to his face. He was this famous cynic. Cynic meaning he was cynical. He didn't like. He spoke badly about human civilizations. In fact, sinis, I think, comes from the word meaning dog. He thought that people should just have sex in the streets like dogs should. Why hide it, right? Anyway, Alexander made a side journey, wherever that was, to visit Diogenes. And he went up to Diogenes with this huge army and all these people. And he said, Diogenes, I'll give you anything you want. What would you like? And Diogenes said, get out of my sun. You're casting a shadow on me. Get out of here. And everyone thought he was just going to have him killed right then and there. But instead, Alexander thought for a little bit and said, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes. Anyway, Alexander died at the age of 33. What he did is he conquered all of this area, but only because he brought his army with him. So he conquers Egypt, and then when he's over here, he's got his army with him. He leaves very little behind in Egypt. So it's not really like the places that he left behind had stayed conquered. And I mean, people were afraid he was going to come back with his army, so they paid him a certain amount of respect. But when he got sick and died back in Persepolis, the empire sort of fell apart. And different parts, different generals, different people took over the various areas. And the Ptolemies took over Egypt. And one of them, the Ptolemy, did this wonderful thing in Alexandria. I call it free college. He said that if you are going to be a scholar or a student and you're going to come to Alexandria, he's going to give you free food. Not necessarily free housing, but free food, because Egypt has so much food. I mean, it probably wasn't meat. It was probably grain, because they grew a lot of grain there. But free food, the one condition, you could not charge for classes. So tuition was free, Aramark was free. People from all over the known world gathered in Alexandria. In fact, they called this place a monument to the Muses. This was a temple to the Muses. The Muses were the goddesses of inspiration, the goddesses of architecture and mathematics and astronomy and all of the areas of wisdom. In fact, so they called it a museum. It was the first museum. And people from all around the world, I mean, back then, as now, nerds were sort of picked on, and so nerds would eventually make their way to the place where it was cool to be a nerd, and that was Alexandria, Egypt, in the 200-300 BC time period. Well, quite some time. And they brought their books with them. They brought books from India. They brought books from Macedonia and Greece and all parts of the world. And they had so many books that they had to create what they called a library. So like one of the first libraries of all time grew up in Alexandria. In fact, after a while, the rule was if anyone came to Egypt and had a book that they didn't have a copy of at the library, they would take it and bring it to the library. You would have to give it to it. In fact, they borrowed some books from Athens at one point and never returned them. Ha ha ha. So anyway, all of this is background just so that when I say Eratosthenes in 200 BC was the head librarian of the Library of Alexandria, you won't think, so he was a librarian? No, he was one of the most powerful, most important people in the world with one of the coolest jobs of all. He was in charge of the repository of basically all of the knowledge of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 civilizations. So, pretty exciting.